Well, good evening. Hope that you all are doing well. If you're watching this live, I want you to go over to the left-hand side of your screen, open up the question and answer box. At that place, you can interact with me, ask any questions that you might have. If you're not watching it live, watching it recorded, then obviously that's not an option for you. Tonight, I want to go over your workbook activities from chapter 4, 5, and 6 of your textbook, Jesus and the Gospels. Hopefully what you're beginning to see is that the historical, political, religious, and cultural background of the New Testament is of utmost importance to understanding the Gospels. And we've talked a lot about this, about how typically we don't think about the background of the New Testament, the background of the text. We just take the stories at face value and we read them that way. But obviously the world of the New Testament, the world of Jesus, will greatly impact how we interpret and translate his stories. So the first chapter, or chapter 4, that we are going to cover tonight, it just deals with the historical and political background of the New Testament. I'm not going to go through and just repeat everything that your textbook had covered, because you can read that if you want all the details. But I'm going to just try to draw a big picture for you, so that you can put some pieces together. And hopefully, if you got lost in the maze from the Assyrians to the Babylonians to the Greeks to the Hasmoneans to the Romans, if you got lost somewhere in that maze, I just want to maybe simplify it and clarify it for you a little bit. As you might recall from the Old Testament, the kingdom of Israel and Judah, they split in right after King Solomon's reign, during the time of Rehoboam. Rehoboam's arrogance and unwilling to work with his people led to the kingdom splitting. So you have now two tribes, the northern tribes. The northern kingdom is called Israel. The southern kingdom is known as Judah. Israel falls to Babylon. And after they fall to Babylon, Israel falls to Assyria, the dominant power of the time. Judah goes on for a little bit longer. Eventually they fall to Babylon. So there's the Assyrians, then the Babylonians come. Babylonians reign for a while, and the Persians take over. After the Persians take over, you will see that after the Persians take over, you'll see in the time of Daniel, that's the Persian Empire. Persians reign for a while. Then Alexander the Great begins to conquer the Middle East. Alexander the Great conquers a big part of land for the Greek Empire, for Greece. Greek culture is very, very influential to Alexander. He's very passionate about it. So everywhere that he goes, he not only conquers these places militarily, but he also brings in Greek culture. So you have things like the Colosseum, Greek-style plays, the Greek language. Greek culture at large takes over the big parts of the empire. Now, for Israel, after they're conquered by Alexander the Great and they're Hellenized, which just means that Greek culture is imparted to them, there's a difficulty that they have, because on one hand, there's this tension here. On one hand, the Jews are treated very well under the Greek rule, under the Greek system. On the other hand, you see that the Greeks are pagans, that a lot of their customs and cultures are antithetical to what the Jews believe and what is written in God's law. And so through that, you see this tension here, that some of the Jews like the freedom and the prosperity that Greek rule brought. Other Jews, not so much. They did not enjoy the paganism of the Greek Empire. So you have that going on. After Alexander, the empire has some infighting. Two main groups emerge: the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The Ptolemies are the first group. Ptolemies are based in Egypt. During their reign, the peace of Israel pretty much continued. They ruled Israel well. They allowed them to practice their religion freely. There were no complications or moments of mistrust, and so that's going along pretty well. It's actually clear enough that one of the emperors wanted the Jewish people to write the to write the Old Testament into Greek. We call this the Septuagint. So they had enough religious freedom to translate the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures into Greek. It's a very important translation. Matter of fact, whenever the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, more often than not, the New Testament will quote the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. That happens because of the relative peace and freedom that the Jews have as this great literary accomplishment happens. It's something that will really shape the scriptures. It will also mean that all sorts of people, even Gentiles, now have access to the Old Testament scriptures because it's written in a language that they can understand. So that happened to the Ptolemies. The Seleucids, then they come next. They kind of outpower the Ptolemies and take over the land where Israel is. Israel does not fare so well under the reign of the Seleucids. They actually don't fare well at all, particularly whenever Antiochus Epiphanes takes control of the area. He does things that are unethical and immoral in the eyes of the Jews. He forces them to become more Greek. He takes away some of their religious liberties they had before. He requires that Jews perform nude in plays and bring nudity to plays, which breaks the moral code of the Torah, of the Old Testament law. But I guess what actually he also attempted to make Jews reverse their circumcision. Not sure how that worked or why, but he did. So you have all this going on, but the pinnacle of his reign, or what causes the most trouble, is that he set up a temple to the Greek god Zeus inside the Jewish temple. So the Jewish temple, which is the holy place where God dwells, Antiochus Epiphanes, he comes into that temple, sets up an altar to the false god Zeus, and sacrifices pigs there. Now, this is the abomination of desolation that Daniel wrote about earlier, and it just was a little bit over the top. The Jewish people have been unsettled, uneasy for a long time, but now they've had all that they can take, and a revolt happens. The revolt happens whenever a priest, Mattathias, is required to offer a pagan sacrifice. He says no. The Roman, or the official, the Greek official, says yes, you have to, and then gets another priest to go ahead and offer that sacrifice. Mattathias has had enough. He kills both the Seleucid official and the priest that would have offered the sacrifice, kills them both, and runs off into the wilderness with his sons, and a small army collects and begins to collect. Eventually, one of his sons, Judas Maccabeus, he is known as the Hammer. So what Maccabeus means, it means hammer. He organizes the army into a guerrilla warfare team. They go throughout the land, attacking, hurting people, just engaging in small acts of terrorism, guerrilla warfare. They defeat the empire, the Seleucid Empire, this way. Additionally, the Seleucids had a lot of infighting and other factors that made them weak and vulnerable to the attack of the Maccabees. They finally reconquer the temple. They cleanse it, consecrate it. This happened, and now we celebrate Hanukkah. That's what Hanukkah celebrates. It celebrates the re-cleansing, the rededication of the temple under the Maccabees. Okay, so now the Maccabees are in control. Things are going to be right. These people that were mighty warriors for God are going to set things right how they should be. But no, it didn't work out that way. Just all throughout Israel's history, it's the same storyline, that there is an unjust, unrighteous ruler of some sort. A more righteous or more worthy ruler replaces him, only to become corrupt himself. And this cycle just continues in this stage of Israel's history. The Maccabees, they have the kingly line that comes from this called the Hasmoneans, which were a line of priest kings. So rather than having a separate king and a separate priest, the high priest and the king was merged into one figure, one character. This is throughout human history, always very dangerous when there is no separation between the sacred and the secular. Dangerous things happen. So this happens here. They begin to rule. They become more and more corrupt, more and more Hellenized, more and more anti-Jewish, and so it just creates some problems. There's a lot of resistance. This time is when the Pharisees emerged. The Pharisees began to say, we need to go back to following God's law more closely. The Sadducees emerged. They're normally supporters of the Hasmoneans, and so they kind of emerge in opposition to the Pharisees and in support of the Hasmonean dynasty. A group called the Essenes. The Essenes say, man, forget all of you guys. We're going to go out in the wilderness and live in caves to get away from these immoral and unjust kings. So that some of these groups that you learned about in chapter 5 really emerged during this time in response to what's happening with the Hasmonean dynasty. Hasmonean dynasty eventually will fall to Rome. It's kind of a convoluted storyline, and I'll maybe not get into all of it, but there was an official called Antipater. He is allowed to continue ruling in place of the Hasmonean by the Romans. Antipater's son is Herod the Great. Herod the Great rules for a while. He's ruling during Jesus' birth. In fact, he is the wicked man who killed all the babies in Bethlehem. We know a lot about him. He's paranoid. He's got some serious issues. And then after Herod the Great dies, he has two sons, Archelaus and Antipas. And Archelaus rules in Judea, where Jerusalem is, and Antipas rules in Galilee, where Jesus was raised and born. So that's kind of the general political background and climate of the general political and historical background for when Jesus comes in, and it really makes room for all of these to. It really brings a lot of continuity to the gospel account. Roman rule continues, relatively peaceful. Roman peace. Because of Roman peace, we see that Paul and his companions can travel safely down the roads because they have good roads. Everyone's speaking a common language now. There's stability in the empire. There's common cultural things that allow the gospel to spread. And this could not have happened if Jesus would have came a few years earlier. The land was still chaotic and spread out and spoke different languages, and there was no peace, no systems. So all this really works to the benefit of the gospel, and it's why the Apostle Paul can say that Jesus came in the fullness of time, that he came at exactly the right time because of Roman rule. So we see that continues along pretty good. Unfortunately, the emperors that take place become more and more hostile to Christianity and to Judaism. So in around AD 70, the Emperor Titus wages war against the Jews. There's a Jewish rebellion. He squashes it. He desecrates the temple, destroys the temple. And from that point on, Judaism and Christianity became split and had a difficult time prospering and growing as far as within the empire. Christianity exploded. But it was as a persecuted religion rather than as an official licensed religion. So that's what we have here. The Judaism then becomes a lot more based on the law, on Torah, on keeping God's commandments, on synagogue worship, because without a temple, there's really nowhere to offer sacrifices. There's really nowhere for the priest to rule. There's no more Sanhedrin, because the temple's gone. So now Judaism has to adjust, and by adjusting, I mean that they become more and more focused on the law, and things become more based in synagogues. And that's where chapter 5 really picks up. Chapter 5 talks to us about the Jewish background, of the of the New Testament. All Jews were fairly homogeneous when it comes to a few concepts. That every Jew believed in monotheism, which means there's only one God. They all believed that the Jewish people were the holders of a special covenant, and that special covenant put them in place where they had a direct relationship with God. Also, they believed that the law was the way to fulfill and to keep their end of the covenant. So they really honored and kept the law. But besides that, there wasn't much continuity or similar beliefs among the different Jewish groups. It's so easy to say, well, in the New Testament, the Jews represented the law, and then Jesus brought grace. The Jews did this, but really outside of those three unifying principles, the Jews disagreed on so much. And so as they were disagreeing on so much, it gives us a rich background to the New Testament, because we see Jesus discussing religious principles with the Pharisees and with the Sadducees, and the Essenes make an appearance, and the Zealots. And so it helps us to know what all those groups believed and how they emerged. Quite simply, the temple was the formal place of worship during Jesus' day. It's where the sacrifices were made. It's where the religious festivals were kept. The temple had its own court called the Sanhedrin. It was the official religious center of Judaism, the official religious center of Judaism. But outside of the temple, every little Jewish community had a synagogue. It had a place where people came together for education, for training, for community. And so in Jesus' day, there was already this little bit of tension between those who were involved in the temple, the Sadducees, namely, the priests, the Levites. Those people, they represent official Jewish religion. In many cases, those who supported the temple and were supported by the temple were good friends with the Roman rulers at the time. So they're kind of in bed politically with the Roman rulers. And so you have that going on in the temple. But then in the synagogue, you had the Pharisees, you had the study of the law, you had scribes who were essentially lawyers, that they learned the Old Testament law so well. So you have this going on over in the synagogues. So the temple, official cultic worship. The synagogue is more like study, down home, the everyday people, common Jews. That's what's going on in the synagogue. Now, everybody would go to the temple for worship, but there was still this tension between the official religious experience of the temple and what was happening in the synagogues. Pharisees, the group that appears the most often in the New Testament. The Pharisees are Jesus's most common nemesis in the gospel accounts. But we also would think that Jesus likely agreed with the Pharisees more theologically and practically than he would have the Sadducees or any other people. That the Pharisees were not inherently evil or bad people. The Pharisees were just trying to figure out how to live out God's law in their time. And they maybe took it a little too far. They got really bogged down in the minutia. But you and I are often doing the same thing. We're reading God's law and reading it in the context that it was originally in, and then trying to figure out, well, how do we live that today? Like, how does that work in our lives? And the Pharisees were pretty much doing the same thing. And Jesus' main concern was that by focusing on what the law said, what the Old Testament text actually read, by focusing on that exclusively, they would often miss the heart of the Old Testament, the heart of the law, the heart of God, so that God never made the Sabbath to be a burden on people. He gave it as a gift to people. That the Sabbath was created for man. That man was not made for the Sabbath, so to speak. That if he healed someone, that's not violating God's Sabbath rule. That's actually bringing them more rest as God intended. So all throughout Jesus' ministry, you see him saying to the Pharisees, like, you're getting this wrong. However, it's often that he's very close to agreeing with them. He's just wanting to give a little more nuance to their perspective. So Pharisees, that's how they emerge. Sadducees are an aristocratic. They likely supported the Hasmonean dynasty. They supported the Roman rulers. They were all on board with the official thing, and they would receive favors from the politicians, and in turn, they would make sure that Judaism always officially complied with the needs and desires of the Romans. So that's what's going on with the Sadducees. Essenes are a group of people that probably theologically believed a lot like the Pharisees, but were a little more extreme. They said, we're not going to do this. You guys are corrupt. This isn't what God wants. We're going to go live in a cave by ourselves and have our own community with our own rituals, our own rites, and we're going to follow the Torah. We're going to follow law to a T there, and we're not going to be corrupted by this pagan society. So we're going out to our little desert place and having a good time. Often we think of John the Baptist possibly as an Essene, someone who's living in the wilderness, someone who belonged to one of these communities that said, quite simply, we're not going to take this, we're not going to do this. So Essenes were a popular group as well. Zealots were groups that took it one step further, that said, yes, we're going to go live in the wilderness. We're going to get away from the corruption of the Roman Empire and of the temple worship and of the Sadducees, and we're going to get away from all of them. But we're not just going to get away. We're going to gather our stuff. We're going to fight, and we're going to kill them. We're going to fight back and take back our land. And just like the Maccabees revolted, we're going to initiate our own revolt in order to get our nation back. So that's a little bit of just of what's going on there with the different groups within Judaism. Your text goes into more detail, but these groups help us understand something about Jesus, is that all of these groups had different expectations of what a Messiah would do, of what a Messiah would look like. To a zealot, a Messiah is someone that's going to come in with a sword and just kill everyone and take over. That's what the role of Messiah would be. To the Pharisee, the Messiah would be one who would obviously overthrow Roman rule, but then represent God's law and to the fullest, and that everyone could follow God's law. The Sadducees were probably not that interested in a Messiah because they had life pretty good under Rome. That Rome was meeting their needs, they were meeting the needs of Rome. Everybody's happy. So all of this gives a background in Jesus' teachings then about what it means for him to be a Messiah. Finally, that kind of gives you the historical and religious background and overview. If you're watching this live, I'd invite you to ask any questions that you have. I'm just kind of winging it. Talking into a camera is probably one of the most awkward things I ever do in my entire life, especially when I don't know if anybody's watching or not. So if I look nervous or get distracted, it's because this is really, really weird. So now let's look at the cultural background. Something that I'm most excited about. And what I'm going to do with cultural background is I'm going to go through these passages, because as I was grading your workbook assignments, this was the only area that maybe some of you guys are a little weak on. You did well with the historical background. You did quite well with the religious background, mostly because the activities that were assigned you just copied it from your book. So it's kind of hard to mess that up. And so thank you for not messing it up, but it was hard to mess that up. But whenever we ask you to actually think through some of these things, it gets a little more difficult. And so I want to go over these stories with you from activity 6.3, the social values illustrated in Luke's gospel. The social values illustrated in Luke's gospel. And there are 5 different accounts here. I want to go through them. I want to point out some of the social values illustrated there, and hopefully that will be helpful to you. In Luke 7:36 to 50, we have the story of Jesus having dinner at Simon the Pharisee's house. According to the text, Jesus walks in. Simon does not offer him any sort of hospitality, does not wash his feet, does not give him any oil for the journey. Back in the first century, you walked everywhere. There weren't vehicles, so you walked, and you wore open-toe sandals. So whenever you got to someone's house, your feet were dirty, as well as the fact that you got a little stinky and sweaty along the way. So the common thing to do was for you to walk in, and if the house had a servant, they would take a servant. Servant would wash your feet, would offer you a little bit of oil or sweet-smelling perfume just to knock the odor off of you from the walk and smell like outside, kind of common courtesy. And so Simon didn't do any of those things for Jesus. And then it says they sit down to dinner, and whenever they are reclining, in the first century, how you generally ate a meal was you would sit down on the ground, you'd put your feet behind you, and you would lean forward, and you would eat that way. Now, here's a curious detail that Strauss does not mention directly. Curious detail that he doesn't mention directly, but I think is quite important, is that I've always wondered, or before I studied, I wondered, how did this prostitute, this woman, how did she just walk into Simon's house? Like, is that normal? Like you're just eating dinner and like a prostitute walks in? But that's never happened to me in my entire life. Like, I eat dinner every night, and it's not happened a single time as far as I know. So how does that happen? And I think how it happens is if we understand that often whenever you had an important guest, you would sit in an open courtyard because you'd want everyone to know that you had an important guest. So if I invited someone over for dinner and I think they're an important person, I want everyone to see, hey, look at this important person eating at my house. This goes back to the first century value of honor, because if someone that is that honorable is eating with me, it must mean that I'm pretty honorable. And that if someone of that high social status is having dinner with me, that means that I must have pretty high social status. And so they're likely eating in an open courtyard. The woman comes up, she opens her hair, which would be a telltale sign of a prostitute in the first century. She empties an expensive bottle of oil, washes Jesus' feet, and then dries it with her hair. Now, this breaks every social custom and convention of the day, that men and women did not act this way to each other. You should not touch a woman who is not your spouse if you're a man, much less a Jewish rabbi. And so this breaks every social custom and convention. And we see that it's that if we don't understand the social values of Luke's world of the first century, then we will miss on like how scandalous this was, that it was so scandalous. And so it was a social taboo. And then we see that Simon neglected every value of hospitality that Strauss mentions, that in the first century, hospitality was the key virtue. Without hospitality, the gospel would have been in trouble, because the only way that preachers like Paul and the other missionaries went around the world was they could expect hospitality. If you go somewhere, someone is supposed to give you a place to sleep and feed you a meal. Our neighbors, a couple houses down from where we live now, are Moroccan. And my wife, Sarada, and our neighbor, the Moroccan lady, her name is Nora, have become really good friends. And every time that Sarada goes over to our neighbor's home, whether she wants it or not, she's going to get a cup of tea and something to eat because of that principle of hospitality. That because they share this Middle Eastern culture, that it doesn't matter if you're hungry. If you come to my house, you're going to eat. It doesn't matter if you're thirsty. Maybe some of your grandmas are like this. If you come to my house, you're going to drink something. It's expected. And Simon did not offer Jesus the most simple form of hospitality, but this woman did. So those are some of the social values we see. Not only is it socially scandalous, this story is also religiously scandalous, because Jesus, who claims to be the Son of God, is having his feet massaged by a woman who's likely a prostitute, and then forgives her sins, which only God can forgive sins. Hey, in Luke chapter 10, verse 38, we read our next story, and it's a story that's famous about Mary and Martha. Every time we hear this story, it's normally about how, you're just supposed to sit at the feet of Jesus and not be busy, but we often miss how scandalous this story is in the first century, how outrageous it is that a disciple of Jesus would naturally be a male, that a woman's job in a scene such as this was to make dinner, to prepare the table, to clean, to prepare the dishes, to clean the dishes, do all the things that Mary was doing. Mary was doing all the right things. Martha was doing all the right things. Mary, sitting at the feet of Jesus, was breaking a social custom. She should not be sitting there. She should not be sitting there. She should be up cleaning and helping as well. So that's what we see there. In Luke chapter 11, verse 5 to 8, there's this really odd story about prayer. It's a parable about prayer. In Luke 11, verse 5 through 8, so what's happening is Jesus is teaching, and he says, if someone knocks on your door at midnight and asks for a loaf of bread, even if you don't want to give it to them, you will give it to them if they keep asking you persistently. You'll give it to them so that they'll go away. And Jesus is saying it's the same thing with prayer, that if you ask your Father in heaven enough, with enough fervency, with enough passion, then it doesn't matter if he even wants to, he will, just based on your faith and how much you activate your prayer life. It's kind of the idea behind the story, but there are some cultural customs that really make the story make a lot more sense. First of all, in a village such as this, there would be a community oven, meaning that everyone would bake bread in one outdoor oven. So if I'm going to go to my neighbor's house and ask for bread, I know which neighbor to go to because I know who used the oven that day. And so that's the first thing that's kind of going on behind the scenes that is easy to miss. So I go there. I know who has bread. They can't tell me they don't have bread because I watched them bake it in the community oven this morning. And so I go there and I knock on the door at midnight, and it's their job to give me, like, based on the most basic rules of hospitality. If I have guests come to my house unexpectedly, I've got to have something to feed them. And my neighbor should understand that if I don't provide food for my guest, I might as well slap them in the face and spit on them. That's how much of a social taboo this would be. But my neighbor wouldn't give it to me. And the majority text, what the Bible normally reads, is that if I ask my neighbor persistently enough, he will give me the bread. But a marginal reading, which may be the correct reading, actually says that my neighbor would give me the bread, not because of my insistence, but in order to save face. That even if he was stingy and did not want to give me bread, eventually he would give me bread because he does not want to lose honor and look shameful. That's some of the cultural things that we see there. Finally, there's a couple back-to-back stories in Luke chapter 14 that touch on a lot of these same themes about honor and shame. Jesus says if you go to a banquet, don't sit at the head table, because then what can happen is that someone better than you that has a higher social status, and if you remember reading the chapter, that social status was very fixed in the first century. You didn't really move up from one place to another. Like whatever you were in life is what you were in life. There wasn't an ambition to move upward. It was more about protecting the status quo. In America, we believe, Western culture, that it's our job to continually better ourselves, to reach high, to have ambition, to be more than our parents were, to be more than our community is. But in the first century, it's quite different. That whatever your position in life is, you are pretty content there, and it's your job to preserve that status quo. And so Jesus is saying if you belong to a lower status, you don't want to sit at the head table, and then someone who's more important than you come in, and then you're going to be asked to move down to a lower table. It would be better for you to start at the lower table, and then if you're someone who wants to honor you by moving you up front, that's a better option than to have the shame of starting at the head table and then going down lower. And to put it in simple terms, if you're a guest minister at a church somewhere, it would be much, much easier to come in, to slip in on the back, and someone come get you and say, hey, I've got you a seat saved up front, rather than just to presume that you're supposed to sit up front and you sit down and someone's like, hey, that seat's saved. Why are you here? That'd be pretty embarrassing. And that's what Jesus is saying in this, is that in the culture of honor and shame, that it's much better to have the honor of being taken from your lower table to a higher table than to be at the higher table and to get demoted to the lower table. We see that in Luke chapter 14, verse 7 to 11, and then 12 to 14. That's kind of the main story there. A few verses later, in 15 through 24 of chapter 14, we see that there is a man who's going to have a banquet, and he invites everyone, all the important people in town, and he asks them to come, and they all give excuses why they can't come. This will be very shameful to the host of the banquet. Meals played a big role in Greco-Roman culture, and that if someone hosts a banquet, you should be there. Like if I invite you, it's embarrassing for you to decline me. It brings me shame, because what you're saying is that I'm not honorable enough for you to take your time to come to my banquet. That no matter what your excuse is, it all boils down to honor and shame. That if you honor me, you will come to the party that I throw. And if you don't come to the party I throw, then it is dishonoring to me. It brings me shame and my family shame. And so that's why the owner, or the host of the banquet, is so angry. It's not because people have things that come up. My goodness, if we got that angry every time someone didn't come to events that we threw, we'd quit ministry like tomorrow, because how often do we plan something and people have all sorts of excuses why they can't come this time? It's too hard to get there. But in a culture where everything's based on honor and shame, it's a lot more than someone just declining an invitation. It's saying, hey, you are not honorable enough for me to take my time to come. And so the owner does something radical. The host does something radical. He tells his servant to go out to the highways, the hedges, to bring in like the poor, the blind, the maimed, the poor, all those, and invite them to the banquet, which in the first century, you did not invite people who did not belong to your same social class to a banquet, because if we eat a meal together, it essentially assumes that we are equals, that we are in the same social stratosphere. And so that's why Jesus got so he raised so much controversy when he would have dinner with tax collectors and sinners, because whenever you ate with something, there was this concept of equality, of equity, that people of the same class, same social strata, have meals together. So if you're eating with sinners, then you're essentially identifying as a sinner. And if you're a host and you have this incredible banquet planned and you invite poor people, you are actually identifying as a poor person. And so it's very upside down to the social values of the time. And it's the kind of story that someone would read it and go, really? Like that actually happened? Donald Trump invited poor people to his house for a meal? Like that's the sort of shock that a first century reader would have experienced. One big reason, and I'm not sure if Strauss mentions this or not, one big reason why this story would be surprising is because there's this principle of reciprocity that's prevalent in first century Greco-Roman culture. The principle of reciprocity quite simply says that if I do something for you, I'm doing it so that you'll do something for me later. That we pay each other favors over and over and over again. So if I do something for you, it's not because I'm nice or because I want to, it's because I expect you to do something for me later. So if I invite you to a great banquet, it's because I expect you to invite me to a banquet later. But if I invite a poor person to a banquet, they can't pay me back. What kind of banquet are they going to throw? Like, it's not possible for someone who's living in poverty to throw a great feast. So I'm doing something with no chance of having my social favor returned. So one reason why the story is scandalous. So I hope that helped. If you have any questions, you have just another minute, because I've done what I wanted to do. I went over the historical world pretty quickly. Most of the information comes straight from your textbook, so I didn't want to go too much detail there. I went over the religious background pretty briefly. Once again, all that information is in your book. I'm happy to answer any direct questions you have about that, but I didn't see a need to go too in depth there. And then we spent a little time in the social and cultural world. Social cultural world, I think, is so much better taught and experienced through the Bible stories themselves than through just reading about them in the textbook. It's so hard to capture principles like honor and shame, hospitality, group mentality versus individual mentality. It's hard to get those concepts just through a paragraph explanation. But once you're aware of those concepts and then you begin to read the New Testament text itself, it'll really come to life, and that all those things make so much more sense and will really illuminate your view and your perspective on the Gospels. So those that attended live tonight, thank you so much for being here. Hope I was able to help. If you're watching this recorded, please let me know if you have any questions. Let me know how helpful this was, and if it was helpful at all, or if I can do anything different. We will do this again soon. Consider maybe changing the format a little bit next time. Since we don't have that many live viewers, I may do this at a time that's a little more convenient for me, and then you guys can just watch the recorded version a little bit later. So we'll see how that. We'll talk about that though. Hope you guys have a great night. Be blessed. Thanks for tuning in. Talk to you soon.